Welcome back, boxing fans, to another great show with Sean on boxing. So, I often talk about how Golovkin's resume would be way better if he wasn't blatantly ducked by a skew of middleweight world champions. World champions. Not just the contenders as well, but the world champions. Like, I think there's a list of 10 world champions during his 16-year career that blatantly ducked him, right? For whatever reason they want to use, a duck is a duck is a duck, son. So people then use the fact that 10 world champions at middleweight ducked Golovkin for the fact that his resume is not as good as it could be. Okay, that's true. We sign off on that. But you also have to understand the circumstances that the guy was fighting through, the circumstances that he had to deal with, obviously with his first German promoter and then coming over to the States as well. It's ironic, people that hate on Golovkin, for some reason they always push these 154-pound fighters, none of whom fought one another. So they were going to fight Golovkin, but they didn't want to unify against each other. Explain that to me, because that tells you everything you need to know about those fucking guys. And then Andre Ward, a guy that literally is clout chasing Golovkin back in the day, and now currently is clout chasing Canelo Alvarez. A guy who is jealous because these fighters made huge money, something he never got an opportunity to do, right? And obviously he feels in his feelings because he feels he's better than them, and he doesn't understand why they got paid more money than he did. Well, they were more exciting to watch. That's probably one thing, but nonetheless, we understand why he keeps doing the things he does. But IBFP today was just putting out a video disparaging and downplaying Bud Crawford. And I mean, we've seen so much Crawford hate for the last 5-6 years. And primarily it's mostly come from PBC, Errol Spence fanboys, right? Now with IBFP pushing this, I can only assume it's because Bud Crawford's been pushing for a Canelo Alvarez fight. And because he's a huge Canelo Alvarez fan, he's coming to the defense of Canelo Alvarez. And the reality is, you don't really need to come to the defense of Canelo Alvarez because he's done everything he's needed to do. He has a better resume than Bud Crawford. He has a great list of accomplishments. If not as good as Bud Crawford, it's very close and very similar. So he's done what he had to do. And luckily, because he was the A-side and did have money behind him, he didn't have the problem of not being able to make the fights, right? But I just assume that's why IBFP is sort of downplaying and dismissing Bud Crawford, because if you want to be fair, you understand why Bud Crawford didn't fight some of the fighters he should have fought. And it had everything to do with the PBC and nothing to do with Bud Crawford, right? Let's just be completely honest. I mean, the PBC literally has ducked this guy from 140 pounds to 147 all the way to 154 pounds. And we've seen the finaglings and maneuverings that the PBC's been doing recently. Now, of course, that Crawford moved to 154, talking about having Charlo come out of retirement to steal the Madrimov fight from Bud Crawford, right? We've seen all kinds of maneuvering. Funduro coming out and say the only fight he wanted was the Bud Crawford fight, only to go into negotiation, have an extension, to beg Bud Crawford so that he would step aside and allow Funduro to do what we always knew he was going to do, which was fight Errol Spence, the guy Bud Crawford just knocked out and sent into retirement. But that's who he wants to fight, not Bud Crawford. That's no surprise, that's no shock. When we think about the fighters from 140 to 154 who've ducked Crawford, it's a long list, right? Mikey Garcia, Danny Garcia, Adrian Broner, right? All at 140. Then you get to 147 and you got Errol Spence, Keith Thurman, right? Danny Garcia again, who is a WBO mandatory, right? Ugis, who is a WBO mandatory. Boots Ennis, who is a WBO mandatory. Virgil Ortiz, who is a WBO mandatory. You see the similarities in these circumstances. These guys all fought under the WBO sanctioning body, all earned an opportunity to fight Bud Crawford for his world title, Yet all of them left the WBO when the WBO uh, pr- proposed or pushed for them to actually fight as the mandatory. None of them wanted that opportunity. They all ducked it. Ortiz went over the WBA to fight for a regular title. Boots Ennis obviously went over to the IBF, waiting in line for an Errol Spence fight. Ugis went over the WBA and won a regular title, only to then be elevated. I can't remember the circumstances by the WBA. Thurman, God only knows what the fuck he's been doing. Even Porter looked like he was going to blatantly duck Bud Crawford, but obviously being the man that he is, a man who always stepped up, he did step up and then got knocked down, right? So, hats off to him for not being a bitch, not being a pussy, and doing what he had to do. And then moving to 154, we saw that Tim Tszyu didn't really want that fight. So that's why Bud Crawford ended up fighting Madrimov. And then we saw Funduro definitely did not want that fight. So they were talking about potentially being stripped by the WBO, right? And Ortiz now in position to do what he could have done at 147, don't want that smoke at 154. Now he's calling for an Errol Spence fight. So he wants to fight the guy Bud Crawford knocked out. He doesn't want to not fight the guy that knocked him out, right? And this is consistent, very similar to the circumstance that Golovkin had to go through, right? And yet people want to hate on Golovkin because of who he didn't fight, even though we all know he was blatantly ducked. And now people are going to hate on Bud Crawford because of who he didn't fight, even though we know he was blatantly ducked. I didn't even mention Manny Pacquiao, right, who obviously ducked Bud Crawford as a top-ranked fighter, and then later on ducked him as a PBC fighter. And I'm a huge Pacquiao fan, so I ain't trying to downplay Pacquiao. He also had done everything he needed to do, so he didn't really need to take on a Bud Crawford fight. He just fought Floyd Mayweather, right, and lost to Floyd. So what was the rationale to then fight Bud Crawford, right? Not so much so. But it's a similar circumstance now currently with Canelo Alvarez. Bud called him out. Turki Al-Sheikh pushed for the fight. Obviously, we knew he's going to pay huge for that fight. Probably much more money than Canelo was making in his last few fights. But obviously, he's fighting a lesser level of opponent. So you're making good money with less risk. And Canelo Alvarez is in a similar circumstance. He doesn't need to fight Bud Crawford. I ain't going to ask him to fight Bud Crawford. He doesn't need to prove anything by fighting a 154-pound champion, right? Because if he wins, he doesn't get any props. If he loses, he doesn't get any props. If he loses, he totally gets ridiculed and rinsed. But if he wins, he gets nothing, right? So it's a no-win circumstance for Canelo, so I get it. But, of course, he's now currently, again, working with the PBC. And we know the PBC don't want to work with Bud Crawford. So they're going to offer alternative fights, not named Bud Crawford. The rumor are that Canelo is going to sign a 2-fight deal again with PBC. And what I've been rumored, or what Ring IQ had been proposing, or somebody had been, I heard it somewhere on YouTube, was that he was going to fight Charlo and then Benavidez, right? Which makes sense. These are two of the last holdouts to the PBC, two fighters you could actually put in Canelo Alvarez pay-per-views and generate more money, so it makes sense. But in the meantime, it looks like Canelo just might be fighting Chris Eubank, right? You fight Chris Eubank instead of Bud Crawford, don't be surprised if people say you're a duck, because Chris Eubank, I don't think anyone would pick him to beat Bud Crawford. I'm just saying. I'm a Canelo fan, so I'm happy that he goes to the UK and fights Chris Eubank. It makes sense. It makes money. I understand. At this point of his career, he's done everything he needs to do. Bud Crawford has as well. Obviously, he doesn't have the rich resume that Canelo has, but a lot of that has to do for the same reasons that Golovkin was in. Fighters ducked him. The PBC blatantly ducked him for years through 3 weight divisions. So if we're going to be honest, we should note that. We should list that. And we should make sure we put an asterisk when we make a statement that Bud Crawford's resume isn't that great, but we all know he was ducked by the PBC. I'm just saying. Obviously, IBFP, big channel, has his own voice, his own opinion. So that's cool. I have no problem with it. But I just think maybe that asterisk would be well used in this circumstance. Let me know what you think in the comment section below.